Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Britain's finance minister wants to boost the country's economic growth, and he's tapping into the nation's vanishing workforce to do that. But will his budget plan help solve the problem? Also this week, President Biden has said that the US banking system is safe, but he's vowed tougher regulations for banks. Who's to blame for the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank? And could SVB's failure force a rethink on interest rates? Plus, Australia's deal to buy nuclear submarines is the country's largest single investment ever in defence capabilities. But is the agreement with the US and UK worth every cent? The British economy is still at a worse state than it was before the pandemic. One of the reasons, there are more than 500,000 British workers who have vanished from the UK workforce since the outbreak of COVID-19, despite unemployment being at historic lows. Now, the collapse in productivity has been a crippling blow to the struggling British economy. Getting Britain's lost employees back to work was a centrepiece of the British Finance Minister's budget plan. Jonah Hull has more on this.
Britain's Finance Minister called it a budget for growth, not the shock measures Jeremy Hunt's predecessor used last autumn.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
But policies instead intended to restore stability and faith in government after a period of political and economic turmoil.
Today we face the future with extraordinary potential. The World Bank said that of all big European countries, we are the best place to do business. Yeah.
Among the measures announced were a series of low-tax investment zones to boost productivity in traditionally underfunded parts of the country, like here in the West Midlands. There were plans to tackle a post-COVID, post-Brexit skills shortage, including help to fund childcare so that hard-pressed parents can rejoin the labour market, and enticements to get some of the more than 8 million over 50s who've left the job market back to work. You're a retired GP.
Yeah.
What would it take to entice you back to work?
My peer group have all retired. When you qualify from Barts back in 1982, there's nothing that will entice me to go back to work now, because I think there's a point in time that you've done your bit, you've done your best, and when you start losing enjoyment in the job, which is certainly what happened in the last 4 or 5 years with all the continual changes in the NHS, there's a feeling of most of us have sort of done our bit and got burnt out and move on.
I think he's trying to go in the right direction. How successful he's going to be, it's another thing.
A question that economists say it's too soon to answer.
I think it's very important for the government to address the labour shortages by all means, but to actually look at where the biggest unemployment rate is. And at the moment, the biggest unemployment rate is not in the over 50s. It certainly is in the 16 to 24 years old, and I haven't seen anything that the government has done for them.
In the short term, of course, the high cost of living remains Britain's most pressing economic problem. And while Jeremy Hunt did offer more help on energy and fuel costs in the hope that inflation falls dramatically by the end of the year, more significant items like tax cuts aren't likely to appear until closer to the election. In the meantime, this budget cannot erase the fact that economic pain is set to continue, with the IMF noting that Britain will be the worst performing G7 economy this year. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, in the West Midlands.
Joining me now from London is Grace Lorden. She's the Director of the Inclusion Initiative and an Associate Professor at the London School of Economics. Many thanks for your time, Grace. Let's start with the UK's vanishing workforce. Why have so many people there not returned to work now that COVID is over, especially given the cost of living crisis?
Thank you, Marlene, for having me on. I really appreciate it. So I guess there's kind of 3 groups that have been the focus of Jeremy Hunt's budget. The first are women who have young children. The second are people who have disabilities. And the third are people who are over the age of 50. And I think if we take the groups of people who are over 50 and the people who have disabilities, the numbers of individuals who haven't gone back to work have risen after COVID. The exact reason for that is unknown. I think the Hunt budget is assuming that it's down to pensions, so that people who are over 50, for example, have done cost-benefit analysis and made an assessment that it's actually worth their while more to stay at home versus going to work. And the budget tries to tackle that. I think for people who have disabilities, again, it's looking to see what is the type of work that's actually available to them. In the UK, there tends to be work that is quite well paid and work that's quite poorly paid. And if you find yourself in the bracket where you are quite poorly paid, and if you are managing a disability, it may actually be in your best interest, both in terms of income and well-being, to stay home. And again, the budget tries to tackle that.
And are these the right sectors of the workforce to focus on in terms of the government? The budget doesn't look at the 18 to 25-year-old mark at all.
Well, I think the answer to that is yes and no. So I think if we take the pressures that are currently on the health and education services, tackling the over 50s is a really good way to go, because it means that people, for example, who already are in work, consultants, nurses coming to the end of their career, might decide to do extra shifts because they're not going over the pension threshold. It also means that people who've decided to come out of the workforce because they've already saved so much pension and it would negatively affect them to work might actually come back into the workforce. But I think the answer is no for sectors like accommodation, food services and construction, where it's unlikely the groups who they've targeted, individuals over 50, people with disabilities and mothers of young children, are going to fill the gaps in those sectors. So I think it's yes for those that fall under public service. For private sectors that are struggling to fill employment gaps at the moment, I think the answer is no.
To what extent can bringing migrant workers in help the UK's labour situation?
From my perspective, migrant workers would solve a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the construction and, you know, in the hotel and retail sectors. And again, this is something that obviously falls outside Jeremy Hunt's remit in the budget, but does feel like that second piece of the puzzle. It feels like he's really tackled public service, but where there's these large gaps, construction and in hotels, migration would be relaxing the migration laws to allow more people to enter the UK would be one way to fill our skills shortage.
I think the other thing worth highlighting is that even those people that are in work in the UK are pretty unhappy. We've seen thousands of people go on strike over pay, the high cost of living. What did the budget do to address their concerns?
The budget doesn't really do anything to address their concerns. And in fact, I know that there has been a statement put out on behalf of the unions representing some of the NHS that basically says that they understand that the over 50s initiatives will help to kind of plug shifts, but it does nothing to plug the gap in pay that people are actually looking for. You know, a lot of our nurses are underpaid, a lot of our teachers are underpaid within the public health services, and it doesn't really tackle that problem. So at the moment, bargaining is happening. It looks like the bargaining will be somewhat successful, probably not getting people what they want, and where that money is going to come from is not addressed in this budget.
The Chancellor said this was a growth budget. Britain, of course, the only G7 economy yet to regain its pre-pandemic size. Do you think the Chancellor has done enough to boost economic growth?
Look, I think there's good things in this budget. I think some of the focuses on carbon capture, quantum computing, I think the tax breaks for R&D are all really good things. I would have preferred something more kind of straightforward done to incentivise companies within the UK, and particularly looking at the corporation tax. One of the benefits that Britain has of coming out of Brexit is that they can actually lower the corporation tax, like Ireland, for example, and them choosing not to do it and doing something with capital rebates feels to me like a missed opportunity for Jeremy Hunt. I think it really comes back to skills. I think if we want to have growth, we need to be investing in skills. We need to be investing in the right skills. And at the moment, within the UK, we spend an incredible amount sending individuals to university. And the skills that they're choosing aren't necessarily the ones that are being demanded in the labour force. So I would love to see a focus on incentives for younger people and older people to study the skills that are needed in the economy, both in the university setting and also in the further education setting.
Really good to talk to you. Grace Lorden, Director of the Inclusion Initiative and an Associate Professor at the London School of Economics. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Silicon Valley Bank was America's 16th largest bank and a lender to some of the biggest names in the technology world. But in a stunning 48 hours, SVB's fortunes turned. It's become the largest bank to collapse since the 2008 financial crisis, sending shockwaves across the world. Now, many consumers were concerned about their deposits and the security of the banking system after its sudden shutdown. President Joe Biden had to address the situation and reassure depositors that their money was safe.
Because of the actions that our regulators have already taken, every American should feel confident that their deposits will be there if and when they need them. Second, the management of these banks will be fired. If the bank is taken over by FDIC, the people running the bank should not work there anymore. Third, investors in the banks will not be protected. They knowingly took a risk, and when the risk didn't pay off, investors lose their money. That's how capitalism works. And fourth, there are important questions of how these banks got into the circumstance in the first place.
Now, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, also known as the FDIC, took over Silicon Valley Bank after failing to find a buyer. Regulators transferred the bank's assets to a special bridge bank for crisis management. They also closed New York-based Signature Bank after mounting pressure. The Fed then announced a new bank term funding program to help banks borrow when facing emergency situations. Bank stocks have seen a lot of volatility after SVB's collapse, especially smaller banks. On March 13th, First Republic shares fell a whopping 62%. Several days later, Credit Suisse shares dropped to an all-time low after its biggest investor said it couldn't provide any more financial assistance. Then Italian banks like UniCredit saw their shares drop as well. Businesses in the US moved their deposits from small to bigger banks. Executives say that was the biggest movement of deposits in more than a decade. So what went wrong at Silicon Valley Bank? Well, during the pandemic, the tech sector enjoyed windfall profits and deposited them with SVB. The bank then took that money and invested it in bonds or treasury bills. But then, of course, inflation hit hard and the Fed raised interest rates from virtually zero to more than 4.5% in the past year. When rates rise, bond prices fall. This caused SVB's portfolio to lose significant value. At the same time, businesses began to withdraw cash to keep their operations running after startup funding slowed. SVB didn't have enough cash on hand, so it sold its bonds at a huge loss. Investors became worried about the bank's health, causing a run on the bank. To talk about these issues in more detail, let's bring in Hugh Roberts. Hugh is the Director of Research and Analytics at Quant Insight in London. Thank you for your time, sir. Now, given the measures taken to protect banks after the 2008 financial crisis, why were the problems at SVB not spotted any earlier?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question. I suspect it's one that's going to be parked for the very near term, at least, because the first wave of any crisis is really about, let's use the firefighting analogy, is about putting the fire out, and the recriminations can start later. The first order effect is to ensure there's no systemic risk, no bank run, and that's what authorities are going to concentrate on first up. But I think the question is entirely valid. I think there will be a lot of questions asked about regulators. It does seem that, certainly in the case of SVB, that it was poor management, a concentration of deposits, poor strategy in terms of the asset side of the balance sheet, and questions should be asked about why this wasn't spotted.
And what is the connection then between what happened at SVB and what is happening at Credit Suisse? Because my understanding is those are two completely different issues.
I agree totally. From a kind of a micro company specific perspective, they are completely independent, no doubt about that. But there is a common thread, and it comes from macro. And the common thread is the aggressive rise in interest rates that we've seen from the Fed in the States, from the ECB in Europe. And the common thread there is to fight against inflation. And what's happened for the last 12 months plus is that inflation has become the overriding enemy. The Fed, the ECB have all been hiking rates aggressively. That has pushed up short-term interest rates, which means that depositors are able to put their money in a money market fund or in a US Treasury or a government bond in Europe that yields the same and is backed by a sovereign, a country. So there's pressure for deposits. And secondly, rising interest rates has hurt the assets that the banks have owned, Treasury bonds, mortgage bonds, government bonds in general. So they've kind of been hit by a double whammy. But to go back to your question, the common thread is the tightening of monetary policy to fight inflation from global central banks.
I understand when it comes to SVB, I mean, that's a reasonably small bank when you compare it to Credit Suisse. If Credit Suisse goes down, are we talking Lehman scale here?
Potentially, I think it would within the European context, because the banking sector is so intertwined and Credit Suisse is so integral within the European banking sector. Even if it is a bad bank that has had these scandals and to some degree has brought this on itself, I don't think the authorities can afford to let Credit Suisse go. The knock-on effect would be too broad, and it would be, as you say, a kind of Lehman-esque moment. But I think, the big lesson from 2008, 2009 was, if central banks feel like they have to act, they do have the wherewithal to do so. Think back to Draghi's do whatever it takes moment. And to be fair to the authorities, the SNB with Credit Suisse have acted very quickly. If you look at how quickly the FDIC stepped in to cover the uninsured depositors at SVB, the authorities have responded pretty quickly in terms of the first up effects, at least.
Absolutely, they have. Very quick to act. But despite that, we're still seeing turmoil in the financial markets. Why is that?
I think your last question is bang on the money, is because it's the fear of unknown in kind of Rumsfeld speak, the unknown unknowns. We know that all these banks have the same exposures, the same basic business model, and therefore the same problems in terms of attracting deposits at the front end and in terms of the asset mix that they hold further out. What we don't know is which banks have employed the right hedges to protect themselves. We don't know which are facing the big deposit flight. We know the beneficiaries of deposit flight. It's the too big to fail banks, the 8 GSIBs, as they're known in the States, globally systematically important. So there's some stuff we know, but it's the fear of how many other SVBs are out there are still propelling things. At its most basic, remember, markets are driven by greed and fear. And when we're in a bear market, it's the fear that dominates, and it's the fear of which banks are hiding is the issue that's driving things. And really, the only things that can stop it are the authorities providing an effective backstop, which they've certainly done at least first up. And then in pure market psychology, a little bit of greed to come back, where you look at some of these distressed levels and say, well, you know what? I quite fancy the risk reward to the upside here, and the long plays come back. So those two intertwined forces, I think, will probably dictate when we can start to think about a bottom.
We talked about the impact the rising interest rates have had on bank balances. Do you think we're at a point that things perhaps are so bad in the financial markets that central banks should actually be thinking about stopping interest rates from going up any further?
On the one hand, yes. When the facts change, you have to adjust accordingly. And there's no doubt that what's happening with the banks is going to impact their ability to make new loans. So therefore, it is going to be a tightening of credit conditions, and that will filter through to the real economy. So there is very real danger that the turmoil in financial markets will spill over into real economy, to employment, to companies. So in that regard, you have to think, central banks should stop and take notice. But you have to remember, what's different this time is inflation. Inflation is not coming down at the pace that people hoped. And that's the reason that the Fed and the ECB were hiking rates in the first place. So trying to marry the needs of financial stability versus the need to fight inflation is an incredibly tough ask. My own personal view would be that they probably still deliver a hike, probably only 25 for the ECB, probably only 25 for the Fed next week, and that they then try and separate out what's called macro-prudential, i.e. all the lending facilities and the backstop facilities that they can direct towards the banks to ensure that liquidity remains okay, and you can see that the money markets continue to operate.
Absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Hugh Roberts, Director of Research and Analytics at Quant Insight, speaking to us there from London. Thank you so much for your time. Australia wants to operate and build nuclear-powered submarines, and it's just embarked on one of its most expensive military projects in decades. The country's deal with the United States and Britain to acquire the vessels will cost up to $245 billion over the next decades. Now, this would make Australia the 7th country in the world with access to such technology, joining the ranks of the US, Russia, China, the UK, France and India. Now, under the deal, Australia will receive 3 US Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines from the US within the next 10 years. And it also has an option to buy 2 more. The price tag involves the cost of building the submarines, as well as the needed infrastructure and training. Now, Russia and China have already criticised the AUKUS pact, saying that it threatens nuclear non-proliferation and could even lead to a new arms race. Well, joining me now in Doha is Alex Gatopoulos. Alex is Al Jazeera's defence editor. Good to see you, Alex. The money we are talking about here is eye-watering. Can the Australian government afford this?
Very good question, and it's touch and go. We're talking about $250 billion over a period of about 25 years. Now, Australia is about 13th in terms of GDP, 1.7 trillion per year. And it currently spends about $38 billion on defence per year. Now, it's doable, but if you have a look at the budget and the way it breaks down, so we spend 6% on defence, 7% on education, 16% on health, and 35% on social services. So when you have a multi-generational deal like this involving 3 countries, that the Australian taxpayer is going to have to foot, there invariably will be overruns, cost overruns, the price will expand, and it's going to be the taxpayer that has to foot the bill, and that is going to be the real issue here. And of course, with Australia having a high turnover of prime ministers, who's to say if the deal's actually going to get to its end? And invariably, the army will lose money, the Air Force will lose money, and of course, low-hanging fruit, it's always social services and health that seem to be cut in during these times.
So why invest all this money on submarines?
First of all, it boosts Australia's combat power dramatically. And this is one of the biggest jumps in military technology Australia's ever really experienced. It gives the Navy a huge reach. Your budgetary and military thinking is constrained by your geography. Now, obviously, Australia being an island on the edge of the Pacific, it needs long-range, everything long-range missiles, long-range aircraft, and of course, a fleet that can actually take the fight to the enemy. Now, the irony is here that the enemy, even though it's never mentioned, is presumed to be China. And international relations with China have been declining regionally and also with Australia. However, China is Australia's biggest partner in terms of trade by an order of magnitude, more than the next 3 combined. So it's a useful thing, it's a powerful thing, but it will only be needed, will only be useful in terms of a war, and we don't know when that's coming.
And it's not just about buying the submarines, is it? It's whether Australia actually has the capacity to develop these submarines.
Yes, very much so. And this is going to be the issue here. You are effectively creating an entirely new industry. Now, Australia has a great industrial base, is leaders in artificial intelligence, leaders in solar power technology, and it has a fairly small but robust defence industrial sector. But you're talking about creating, first of all, you have to revamp the ports at Perth to be able to allow the visiting Virginia-class submarines from America. Then you have to be able to supply and outfit and maintain your own fleet of Virginia-class submarines, some of the most highly complicated machines on the planet. And then you're going to have to build your own, which is going to be a hybrid of Australian, American and British technology that hasn't even been designed yet. So all that is going to have to be done in Australia over the course of the next 25 years.
Well, China have already come out and criticised this move, this deal. They have warned that it could trigger some sort of arms race. Is that a real concern?
The arms race is already there. Now, it's a chicken and egg situation. Xi Jinping has always been concerned with China being able to protect its own interests, obviously being a global power. Therefore, it needs to have a global reach, which is only reasonable. Many other powers do exactly the same thing. But of course, this has made China's neighbors nervous. Japan is going through a rearmament program. South Korea is going through the same, and also the Philippines. And Australia now is following suit. So the arms race is already on.
Alex, really good to talk to you. Our defence analyst, Alex Gatapoulos, speaking to us there. And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us by tweeting me at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or, of course, you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That will take you straight to our website, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera coming up next.